topic we'll be discussing today explains why some cultures are successful and others are not, and probably will never be unless they make a mental shift. Before diving into the explanation of the reasons that make some cultures successful, it is important to first and foremost define two essential terms: collectivism and individualism. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the GGV Publishing Podcast. This is your host, Jeremy Olvan. Let me first start by analyzing collectivist culture, then I will move to individualistic culture. Collectivist culture is a framework that prioritizes the needs of a group or a community over the needs of individuals or the people within that community itself. In collectivist cultures, people are seen as part of a larger group and their relationships with each other are central to their identity. Collectivist cultures value harmony, kinship, family, and community. And people tend to work together to achieve these goals. So in theory, these values are absolutely irreproachable. In fact, they're noble. Individualistic cultures, on the other hand, prioritize personal preference and self-interest, whereas, as I said, collectivist cultures prioritize the group over the individual. Individualistic cultures value independence, personal identity, and more importantly, personal achievement. It is important to understand that in individualistic cultures, people tend to look out for themselves more than they seek the best for others. For example, an individualist can make decisions with little oversight from their immediate family, such as marrying someone their parents may not approve of, or moving to pursue a better salary. So it is important to understand that in individualistic cultures, people view themselves as autonomous and stable. Whereas in collectivist cultures, or collectivists view themselves as dynamic and defined by their relationships and social context. In individualistic societies, success is defined in terms of rights and how someone approaches something. In collectivist societies, success is defined in terms of group dynamics. So where do we find individualistic cultures? Mainly in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, perhaps Hong Kong, and pretty much all the countries of the G7. And where do we find collectivist cultures? We find collectivist cultures in East Asia, Latin America, and many African countries. Now, the logical question to ask ourselves is, which one of the two is better, or should I say the most prosperous, and why? So, historical evidence shows that Western European cultures have been far more prosperous than East Asian, Latin American, and African cultures. But why? Well, because Western European cultures have always prioritized the individual above the group. The tenets of individualistic cultures rest on the concept of methodological individualism. The central idea of methodological individualism is that social phenomena are the result of individual actors' subjective personal motivation. The economic and social phenomena that we observe are nothing but the product of the choices, preferences, and values that each individual exerts when making decisions. Indeed, the individual is the primary unit of social consciousness. That means that everything starts from the individuals and with the individuals. Hence, society is nothing more than an aggregate of individuals exercising their subjectivity on a daily basis and reaping the consequences of their choices based on that subjectivity. Consequently, the methodological individualism approach is a bottom-up approach to analyzing and understanding society, since everything starts with the individual and goes back up to the collective. The principles of collectivist cultures, on the other hand, rest on the concept of holism. They see society as an organic unit completely independent of the individuals who make up that unit. Holism is the belief that each individual is a whole that is more important than the parts that make it up. Hence, holistic approach perceives society as having its own purposes that have nothing to do with that of the individuals that make up that society, as it takes an aggregate viewpoint on the structure of society. Therefore, it has a top-down approach to society. This aggregate viewpoint means that in order to examine social phenomena, we must start from the top, from the whole, then descend to the particular. The central feature of holism is that it is an approach that relies on the power of a central authority to make decisions for society. It makes those decisions by uniformizing individuals. It assumes that everyone has the same purpose and therefore relies on the very same resources to fulfill the purpose. Hence, the opinion of the individuals that make up society are not consulted. But the major flaw of collectivist societies is that they tend to think that society has goals, whereas society does not have goals. Only individuals do have goals. Thus, there is no social action if there is no individual action. Any action taken by an individual leads to consequences conditioned by externalities. In other words, the actions we take affect those around us to some degree, whether considerably or marginally. So when we compare individualistic and collectivist cultures, we realize that there is a high degree of inequality in individualistic cultures, while there is a high degree of poverty in collectivist cultures. I find this dichotomy fascinating. It is important to emphasize, however, that inequality does not equate poverty. It's not because there is a high degree of inequality in a country or in a society that there is massive poverty in that society. For example, during the Gilded Age, so between 1870 and 1900, wealth inequality significantly widened between the rich and the working class in America. But the American working class had a much higher income per capita than the European working class. That is why during the Gilded Age, we saw a massive shift, a massive transfer of labor from Western Europe, or even from Europe in general, not even Western Europe, from Southern and Eastern Europe to the United States. That was at the time when immigration came in mass in the US. In collectivist cultures, on the other hand, most people are equally poor. For example, in a country like Burundi, income per capita is pretty much $262 according to the latest data of the World Bank. This means that at least more than 2/3 of the Burundian population lives in extreme poverty. Why do individualistic societies have a higher degree of inequality and collectivist societies have a higher degree of poverty? The answer is very simple. The causes of poverty and inequality are based on individual choices, because the individual is the primary unit of social consciousness. This is because poverty and inequality are determined by the management of our resources. Individuals may have the very same amount of resources, and yet they will still produce different outcomes. And this difference in outcome is based on utility, how each individual utilized the resources available to them. In individualistic societies, inequality is higher because individuals allocate their resources differently. They allocate their resources according to their choices, values, and preferences. And since each individual is different from one another, as we are endowed with a set of skills unique to each of us, individuals will then generate different outcomes, and this difference in outcome is what creates inequality. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, have a much higher degree of poverty because the group prevents the individual from using the full might of his skill set to generate optimal outcomes. Responsibility and accountability are essential factors in human flourishing. When an individual is aware of the impact of the responsibility and accountability of every decision he makes, he then seeks to optimize the outcome of his choices. In collectivist societies, however, individual responsibility and accountability are undermined because the group is prioritized over the individuals. And since the group is prioritized over the individual, then no one within the group is particularly held responsible and or accountable for the action of the group. Thus, within the group, some members do not feel responsible or do not hold themselves accountable for the consequences of their actions. Collectivist cultures create a transfer of responsibility where the burden of individual responsibility is transferred from the least productive members of the group to the most productive members of the group. And this then creates a system of dependence within the culture of the group, and dependence leads to poverty. And this is why there is a high degree of poverty in collectivist societies than in individualistic societies. Does it mean that collectivist cultures are doomed to be poor? No, they're not doomed. They're not doomed because they are individuals. That means that collectivist culture can be rich if they shift their mindset or their mind from a collectivist mindset to a individualistic mindset. That's all. So I personally do not think that collectivist societies are doomed to be poor. The only way for them to remain poor is to keep being collectivist, is to keep prioritizing the group over the individual. But if collectivist societies decide to adopt an individualistic mindset, that's when prosperity will start to occur. It's simple as that. Even when you look at Europe, you look at Northern Europe and you look at Southern Europe. Southern Europe are more collectivist. When you look at, for example, the Italians value a lot the family, kinship. They always prioritize the need of the group over the individual. But when you look at Northern Europe, like Germany, the Scandinavian countries, they're more individualistic. And you look at their income per capita, you look at their living standard. Northern Europe has higher living standard than Southern Europe. It's not a random. It's not a random fact. It's based on something, and that's what it is. Is that in order for a society to prosper, we have to prioritize the need of the individual first, because it is by prioritizing the need of the individual first that the individual will be able to maximize what he or she is seeking to maximize and then redistribute to others after. But in collectivist society, we even prevent the individual to maximize his potential. Whenever the individual is starting to do well, we request the individual to start redistributing whatever he earned. We especially see that in African culture, and I personally believe this is a massive problem. So, collectivist societies are not doomed unless they want to remain collectivist. And as I said again, they're not doomed because they are first and foremost individuals within these societies. The individual can always change. The individual is not static. So, when we see a collectivist society becoming prosperous is not because of the group they became prosperous, it's because they made a shift. They moved from the group, or should I say from the needs of the group to the needs of the individual. At the end of the day, society does not have goals. Only individuals do. There is no magic formula for prosperity. For a society to prosper, we must let the individuals pursue their self-interest and maximize the potential of the outcomes. That's how society prosper. But we cannot prosper as a society if we prioritize the need of the group over the need of the individual. It doesn't make sense. It was tried before through socialism and all derivative of socialism, and it still didn't work. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys next time. And please do not forget to subscribe to the GGV Publishing Podcast.